So you're about to watch a church experience message. If you'd like to learn more or get connected or help fuel the movement by giving online, just click on the appropriate links on the website.
Hey, happy Memorial Day weekend, Rebels. What's up? It's great to see you guys. Thanks for being here today. Hey, we're in the second week of this series that we've called Rebels. And if you were here last week, you heard us talk about pride being at the core of a rebel heart. And pride being what pushes us beyond being the good kind of a rebel, where you rebel against ordinary so that you can apprehend the extraordinary. But pride being the thing that pushes you beyond those limits into the realm of being not just a rebel, but rebellious. And rebellious against someone, against God, and doing our own thing and living for ourselves. And we talked about humility. And this week we're going to move on from talking about pride, and we're going to talk about pleasure. Pleasure is probably one of the greatest struggles and battles that a rebel heart has to navigate. Pleasure is good in many ways, and it's created by God and for us. But pleasure can get us in a world of hurt. And that's why I put the very first point in your notes, this, if you'd like to write it down. Living for pleasure can steal a purposeful life and leave us with a painful life. Living for pleasure can steal a purposeful life and leave us with a very painful life. You know, if I could put it in an image, I would describe it this way. Let's go ahead and throw this image up on the screen. This is how I would describe the pain of pleasure. You know, these kids, they find this big gallon of white paint and they think, man, this is going to be a lot of fun. It sure looks like this is going to be fun. And they're smearing it on the carpet and on the television screen, as you can see. And man, and then they're in a world of trouble when mom and dad find out this, right? Because what started as something that looked fun and engaging turned into something that was very destructive and left long-term consequences. And that's really what happens in pleasure, right? In the rebel heart, in our hearts that kind of pull us off path so easily. It begins with just a little fun and, it looks alluring, but then pretty soon it robs from us the purpose that we should be living for, and it leaves us with pain. It leaves us with regret. It leaves us with guilt. It leaves us with shame. And God doesn't intend us to live that way, yet He does intend for us to live with pleasure. So how do we figure that out? Well, what are we talking about here when we talk about pleasure? Well, if we looked at a very simple definition of pleasure in the dictionary, it would tell us that pleasure is the state of being pleased, of enjoyment, satisfaction, gratification, delight, or amusement. That's what pleasure is. And we kind of know this instinctively. And we were really created to enjoy pleasure. This is true. You can look to the very opening chapter of the Bible, Genesis chapter 2, verse 8. God creates this beautiful garden that we know of if you know much of the biblical story. Verse 8, I just want to read a small portion to you. It says, "Now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east," the very first garden created by God. It says in Eden. "And there He put the man He had formed." He created man. He puts them in the context of this beautiful garden. Verse 9, "The Lord God made all kinds of trees to grow out of the ground." There were trees that were pleasing. Everybody say pleasing real loud. Pleasing. They were pleasing to the eye. So they must have been palm trees, right? That's what I'm thinking. All variety of palm trees. He creates all these trees that are pleasing to the eye and what? And good for food. Everybody say good. They're good for food. So when He first creates man, He puts him in the context of this beautiful garden. He could have put us anywhere, but he takes the first man and the first woman, and He says, "I'm going to create a beautiful setting for you." that's pleasing, as it says, to the eye. Or there's food that's good for your stomach, because I want you to enjoy. I want you to live life to the full and experience my kindness, because God is a kind God. And He's a good God, and He wants us to experience that. That pleases Him when we are experiencing God-created, God-given pleasure in Him and through Him and for Him. And that's honoring to Him and pleasing to Him. That's how the world started. You know, there's a long list of things that induce pleasure in our lives, and it's unique for every person. But what we do have in common is that we were together created to experience and enjoy pleasure, and from the very beginning, we were created to be surrounded by it. But not only from the beginning, if you look all the way to the end and you look at the closing book of the Bible, Revelation, we see that not only is God's intention to begin, but also to end, if you can even call it an ending, end in pleasure. Revelation chapter 21, verse 4. It says this, it says, one day, God, He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning, no more crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who is seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. I'm making everything new. So one day, Jesus is going to come back, and He's going to make everything new. And He's going to take those who believe in the name of Jesus, who've been forgiven of their sins. He's going to take us into paradise, and it tells us that no mind has imagined, no eye has seen how beautiful it is. So God has pleasure awaiting for us, and that's why even in the midst of hardship and pain that could last for the extent of our lives, we can still say the best is yet to come. Because the best truly is yet to come. Because with God, He has pleasure awaiting us. He has good intentions for mankind. I like the Psalms, and I like Psalm 16, specifically verse 11. It says, You, God, you make known to me the path of life. You fill me with joy in your presence. With eternal what? Come on, with eternal what? Pleasures. With eternal pleasures at your right hand. So God's intention for us is to experience joy, to experience pleasure. God desires this for His people. However, God knows that in our rebel heart we tend to take something good and so quickly turn it into something bad and use it for what was intended for good we can use for evil. And our lives were not created for pleasure alone, to just purely only enjoy pleasure. That's not God's intention for us. You know, it's interesting when you take anything good and you take it out of context or take it to the extreme, it can become bad for you. You know, things like, even food. You know, we all probably love a healthy amount of sugar. But do you ever think about sugar and what it does and what it can do if it's taken out of proportion? Take a look at this. It's just kind of interesting.
Picture warm, gooey cookies, crunchy candies, velvety cakes, waffle cones piled high with ice cream. Is your mouth watering? Are you craving dessert? Why? What happens in the brain that makes sugary foods so hard to resist? Sugar is a general term used to describe a class of molecules called carbohydrates, and it's found in a wide variety of food and drink. And sugar isn't just in candies and desserts. It's also added to tomato sauce, yogurt, dried fruit, flavored waters, or granola bars. Since sugar is everywhere, it's important to understand how it affects the brain. You take a bite of cereal. The sugars it contains activate the sweet taste receptors, part of the taste buds on the tongue. These receptors send a signal up to the brainstem, and from there it forks off into many areas of the forebrain, one of which is the cerebral cortex. From here, the signal activates the brain's reward system. This reward system is a series of electrical and chemical pathways across several different regions of the brain. It's a complicated network, but it helps answer a single subconscious question. Should I do that again? That warm, fuzzy feeling you get when you taste Grandma's chocolate cake? That's your reward system saying, yes. And it's not just activated by food. Socializing, sexual behavior, and drugs are just a few examples of things and experiences that also activate the reward system. But overactivating this reward system kickstarts a series of unfortunate events: loss of control, craving, and increased tolerance to sugar. The major currency of our reward system is dopamine, an important chemical or neurotransmitter. There are many dopamine receptors in the forebrain, but they're not evenly distributed. Certain areas contain dense clusters of receptors, and these dopamine hotspots are a part of our reward system. Drugs like alcohol, nicotine, or heroin send dopamine into overdrive, leading some people to constantly seek that high. In other words, to be addicted. Sugar also causes dopamine to be released, though not as violently as drugs. Think back to all those different kinds of sugar. Each one is unique, but every time any sugar is consumed, it kickstarts a domino effect in the brain that sparks a rewarding feeling. Too much too often, and things can go into overdrive. So yes, overconsumption of sugar can have addictive effects on the brain. But a wedge of cake once in a while won't hurt you.
Man, that's fascinating, isn't it? Now, how many of you are hungry and you want some sweets, right? You're ready to go. But it's so fascinating. And the more I learn about science and life and nature, the more I'm amazed by God. And you see the complexity of it. It's too incredible for this all to be an accident. The more I learn, the more my faith grows. It would take more faith for me to believe that this is all some accident. Because you see the intricacies and the complexity of how God created the mind and how it's triggered and how it works and how it functions. It's just amazing. And you know what? The sugar example is so illustrative for us when we think about pleasure. God's something that He intended for good, something to bring pleasure to our lives, something to bring goodness into our lives and for us to enjoy. But we so naturally take it out of context, right? We take it beyond the boundaries and we, our minds kickstart, well, this feels good. Well, I'm going to go back for more. And you know what happens is that thing, whatever it is, that brings pleasure into our lives, that gets elevated. That gets elevated spiritually, and it can become for us a god, an idol, something that we put on the throne of our lives, and we start to live for that, we start to worship that. That becomes what our lives are about, and we're driven by that. And here's what I'd love to have you know, and it's in your notes, is that pleasure makes for a horrible God. Pleasure makes for a horrible God. God has given us pleasure to enjoy, but pleasure itself makes a horrible God. And so if you live for pleasure in whatever form and fashion that takes on in your life, it makes for a horrible God. Someone actually did an experiment, and it's been recorded for us. They did an experiment on, what would it look like if I pursued every form of pleasure that this world has to offer? If I just lived for it, what would that look like? And thankfully, God recorded this for us in the Bible, but He didn't just record it through the life of, the average person. He took the wisest person who's ever walked this earth, this solely human, and that was the man Solomon. We know a little bit about his story in the Bible, and Solomon was a man filled with wisdom, and he lived for pleasure. And listen to what he writes. These are his own words. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, he says, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, it's madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine, embracing folly. I delved into the party life a little bit. He says, my mind's still guiding me with wisdom, but I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. Verse 4, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs with water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and I had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself, the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. So thankfully, we don't have to live our lives pursuing pleasure and wondering, will that make me happy? Because here's the wisest person who ever lived, and he lived purely for pleasure, and he took on all forms of it. Right? He took on accomplishment, and that's a pleasure in, doing great things and making a name for himself and becoming great, and physical pleasure and material wealth, and he took on every form of pleasure, and he said, after all has been said and done, here's the end of the story. Pleasure itself is meaningless. It's not a God worth living for. And that's why I put that in your notes, that it really makes for a horrible God. And if you live your life for pleasure in any form, it can take on the form of your career or wealth or some kind of addiction or anything, and you put that on the throne of your life, it makes for a horrible God because it will not fulfill you. In the end of your life, you will live with regret if that's what you live for. You will look back on life no matter how great your accomplishments. And here's a king, literally a king of this earth, who had a kingdom, and it was an incredible kingdom, humanly speaking. A man of great wealth, a man of great accomplishment, a man who experienced life as we might call life, and he says, in the end of the day, that did not fulfill this craving of my soul. That was not worth living for. Not worth giving your days to pleasure. In the end, it's meaningless. You gain nothing under the sun. It comes and it goes. In fact, I think this is interesting. Verse 16, he says, for the wise, like the fool, will not be long remembered. The days have already come when both have been forgotten. Like the fool, the wise too must die. Here's the wisest man on earth saying this. So man, what's worth living for if it's not pleasure? I mean, there's got to be something more. Because pleasure makes a horrible God. It's not worth living for. It comes, it goes, it so quickly vanishes. It can be stolen from us. When I was 19 years old, I was at a camp in Glendo, Wyoming. And Jennifer and I had just started dating. I mean, it was fresh. It was a few weeks, maybe a couple months into it. Young love, we're late teen years, and we're at this camp. We're actually volunteering and helping lead this youth camp. The week goes on. It's at a dude ranch setting, and they're going to do this big rodeo at the end of the week, and it was so cool. Like it's kind of like the pinnacle of the week, and we're building up to that. And Jennifer and I were there at the rodeo, and we find out, like a couple hours before it starts, that they're going to do bull riding. And I always thought that bull riding is really cool. We're in this Rebel series. I'm telling you about some of my adventures in this series, and I told you about skydiving and showed you a video of the time I went skydiving last week. And so bull riding, I'm like, man, that's right in line with what I love to do, that kind of stuff. And so I'm like, hey, can I get in on that? They said, well, you have to be 18. I'm 19. All right, well, you can do it. Here's the deal. Sign the waiver. Sign your life away. If you die, we're not responsible. You could die. You might die. If you do, we're going to cheer. But, we'll do a funeral, And so I'm waiting for my turn to ride this bull, and it gets to be my turn in the rodeo. And, the whole thing is like to last 8 seconds. That's the thing. And you're like, well, okay, that sounds easy. I should be able to last 8 seconds on this animal. Of course, that doesn't sound like a big deal. But you get there, and it's your turn, and you come up to the gate, and there's this massive piece of meat. They said in there, it's like, that is like a train. That's not an animal. It's a big old thing. And it's got these horns, like, just coming out of its head, and they are sharp on the end. I mean, you can see, do we got a picture up here? Look at this thing. I mean, that's intense, and like that could spear you. And so what happens is I go up to the edge of the gate, and the guy starts messing with the bull. He's trying to get him riled up. And so he's got some kind of stick, and he starts poking the bull. I'm like, dude, what are you doing? Like, you don't need to do that. We're good. And he's like, no, we got it. And I'm like, no. So he gets him all excited, and he's like, all right, we want you to step on this, up on this gate, and then we want you to set on the bull. So he's there in the pen, and I straddle this big, massive bull, and I'm on there, and I hold on to this rope, and he's all like charging, ready to go. And at that moment, I realized that this is real. Like this is not just like a pony ride, It's like, I can ride a pony. Like, this is different, and I'm saddled in. It's too late to get out. And so they do the countdown, 3, 2, 1, and the bullpen gate swings open. And this thing, I mean, I cannot describe to you what happened next. I mean, it just started throwing me like I have no idea. Like, I'm just being thrown everywhere. My eyes go into the back of my head. And I'm so disoriented. And all I can do is hold on to that little rope. And 2.5 seconds later, I'm on the ground. I'm on my backside. But the crazy thing is that all of a sudden you hit your senses when you hit the ground, because you realize that big piece of meat that you were on now sees you as the target, right? And there's some other people around trying to distract it, but you get up and you run for that fence. And I've never run so fast in my life. And I had a little limp because I got hurt as I fell out, but I'm like running to this fence. I climbed it so fast. I was out of there, man. But that was an intense moment for me. But you know what? It was a great moment. But man, it's amazing to me how this whole event, this whole thing, 2.5 seconds and it's gone and it was over. And there was so much build up to a couple hours of, getting ready and preparing all that and then waiting for the moment. And there's all this training and here's what's going to happen and here's what you need to watch out for. And then boom, it's gone. And such is life. And such is pleasure. it's so alluring, and it's epic, and it's adventurous, and it pulls us in, but then it happens, and it's gone, and it's over. And if you live for pleasure, and if you live for that moment, the moment will dissipate, and what you're left with is sometimes only a memory. And if it was something you did, and you experienced pleasure in God, and it was something that He allowed, and you stayed within His boundaries for it, and it was good, and you had this good memory. If it was something you took it beyond its context, and you took it out of the boundaries, then you have this thing called guilt, shame, and regret, and you carry those, but it's gone, it's over, and it vanishes quickly. So when we chase pleasure with our life, it can so easily derail us. It can put us in a ditch of life and cause us to miss out on the real blessings that God has for us. In our flesh, we're naturally driven by pleasure of many different variety. We're driven by it. We have this propensity towards it. And unless you have a strong internal compass, which I would contend should be the Holy Spirit of God that comes inside you when you become a follower of Jesus, unless you have that strong internal compass of the Spirit of God guiding your life, then you'll naturally be derailed and drawn into pleasure and take it beyond its context. And it will create all kinds of pain and messes. It can lead us into things like addictions. And if you're there, you need to get help. You're not going to just try harder and get yourself out of it. You need to reach out and get help. It can lead us into apathy, where we live for pleasure so much so that it's about us, and we just become lethargic in life that it's nothing but fulfilling cravings. Or it can lead to appetites that are never satisfied, and endless chasing and pursuit of more. But when pleasure starts to pull you off the path, you'll only give it up for something that you love more. You'll only leave pleasure for something that you love more. Check this out.
And I would do anything for love. Oh, I would do anything for love. I would do anything for love. But I won't do that. No, I won't do that. I would do anything for love. Anything you
Fall in love with the rich, bold flavor, Dr. Pepper. One taste, and you get it.
I love that. Come on, that's good, isn't it? Man, the dude's in the store with a box of tampons, and he's like, I would do anything for love. It's like he's folding underwear. Anything, but I won't do that. It's funny because there's some irony in that. There's some truth in that, too. I mean, it's like there's certain things we will do and certain things we won't do, and you'll only give up something that you would be willing to do, or in this case, not do, for something that you love more. And I put it this way in your notes if you'd like to write it down. We will only give up something we love for something we love more. So we'll only give up some kind of pleasure in our life or something that brings enjoyment to us or satisfaction. We'll only give that up, something we love, for something that we love more. The order and priority of our loves is so important because priorities determine what we will chase, but also what we'll give up. Priorities determine what we will chase and what we will give up. Pleasure is about, in the core of it, is about what we love most. Pleasure is about what we love most. That could be the love of making good choices, which is conviction. And so we love that more than the alternative. It could be the love of doing the right thing, which is morality. That could be the love of another person that keeps us from hurting them, which is compassion. That could be the love of a commitment you made, which is character. But a greater love always keeps us from a lesser love. A greater love always keeps us from a lesser love, and that's true, and that's a principle that kind of directs our lives. And that's why it's so important that Jesus is the center of our lives, and that's so important. It's the reason why God, when He established His very first commandments for mankind, the 10 commandments, the foundational kind of primary commandments He gave us, that's why the first one reads this, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 3. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall have no other gods before me. You know what God's saying here? He's saying the order of your loves is important. That's why I have to be on the top of the list. I have to be number one in your life. I can't be number two. I can't be backseat. I can't be the third party. I have to be number one. For you to follow me, I have to be number one. And so that's what He says, the very first commandment, the lead commandment. Before anything else, He says, you shall have no other gods before me. I have to be number one. God was saying I must be first and only, because if I'm second, you will abandon me to pursue another God, another idol. And that could be anything that you put in that place, because anything you put in God's place is what the Bible calls an idol, and you worship that. And you don't maybe sit around and sing to it or talk, but you live your life for it, and that becomes an idol if that's what you're driven by and that's what you live for. And it's going to make a horrible God, but it displaces the true King of Kings and the true God. And so that's why order of our loves is so important, because we'll abandon the lesser love in pursuit of the greater love. And if God is not the greatest love of our lives, which he should be, because he's the most fulfilling, the most kind, and he can bring pleasure into our lives, eternal pleasure, in a much more significant way than anything in the created world. In Romans, it talks about how mankind has exchanged worship of the Creator for worship of the created. And so we live for the pursuit of life, and we worship God, and we go out and, oh man, life is beautiful, and this is great, and I love this, and we live for those things sometimes, but we're exchanging something that's really lesser. We're taking the lesser instead of worshiping the greater. When we worship the greater, which is God, and we live for God, he fills all those created things. The Creator does. He infuses it with joy. And so then we find even greater pleasure because we're finding our real source of joy in him. And then we worship him, and he says, well, here, all I've created for you. Just like the first man and woman when he placed them in the garden, he said, I've made it for you to be pleasing, and I've given you food that's good for your stomach, and it's for you. It's from me. And man, it's if you could just live that way, and if you could just live and keep your eyes on me and joy in the context, I'm just asking that you don't do these things. And of course, from the very beginning, that rebel heart in us, it drew us off center. And we said, well, thanks, God, but I also got to go do my own thing. And we started worshiping pleasure. You know, the priority of what we love is so important. And you know how we know the priority in our lives? It's displayed in times of testing. It's displayed in times of testing. I felt God kind of leading me towards a story in Genesis that I was a little reluctant to teach on, especially at church. We're 4 months in, because this is honestly a pretty intense story in the Bible. It's like, man, are we ready for this? I mean, this is pretty intense, like jumping into the deep end of the pool, but I just kind of sense that God wanted me to share this. And so for the remainder of our time, I just want to focus on this one specific story, but I think it'll leave a deep impact in our lives if you can grasp a hold of what's behind it. Genesis chapter 22, there's this guy named Abraham. Abraham being the father of this nation, Israel. And it was really formed based on a relationship, which is what all things that God does out of relationship. And he forms a relationship with Abraham. And, you know, you honor me, and I'll honor you, and I'll make you a great nation. And he has a son, and his son has a son. And they have these 12 kids, and the 12 kids become the 12 tribes of what becomes this great nation of Israel that God uses to so illustrate for us his relationship with us throughout the Bible. And there's so much more in that. But let me just end there to say this Abraham is going to be the beginning of a great nation that God's going to do great things through, and that teaches so many things for the centuries. Well, it begins in this relationship, and God says, I want you to trust me. And I'm going to ask you to go somewhere, and I'm not going to even tell you where that's at this point. I just want you to have faith to trust me and go, and I'm going to make a place for you. And he follows him, and you know, God's faithful. And then he says, I'm going to give you a son, and your son, Isaac, is going to be your inheritance, and out of him is going to flow this nation, you know, because now we know the story that Isaac had a son, Jacob, and God changed Jacob's name to Israel and all that. So he says, you know, this is very important, this child. Well, God gives him this child, but then he asks him to give it up. And he has him late in age. It's really a miraculous thing, and so there's not really this natural hope of having another kid. I mean, Isaac's like the hope, right? And Genesis chapter 22, beginning in verse 1, it says, sometime later, God tested Abraham. And I think that's important to say that, God, this is a unique situation, and it's specific in its context. And I don't know of any other scenarios where God has asked this specific thing, but it was specific to Abraham. And it was really a test, as you'll see. It wasn't something he was actually asking him to do in the end. It was proved to be a test, but this is important to know. Sometime later, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham, here am I, he replied. And then God said, take your son, your only son, this is Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain that I will show you. And sacrifices was a part of their faith and how they connected and related with God prior to Christ, and as one of the ways that they worshiped him. He says, I want you to go sacrifice this son that I've given you. And he's testing him. Down in verse 3, early the next morning, Abraham got up and he loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place that God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and he saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there, and we will worship, and then we will come back to you. Verse 6, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, and he placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, so he's an old enough boy to ask this question, know what's going on. He said to him, yes, my son, Abraham replied, "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" This would be what would be normal. Verse 8, Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb." So he has faith that God's going to work this out. He knows that God's promised his seed through Isaac, but he's also asked him to give up Isaac, and he may not fully understand, but he's being faithful to do what God's asked him to do. And he said God will provide, and the two of them went on together. Verse 9, when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac, and he laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand, and he took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here am I," he replied. Let's pause there for a moment. Before we read the conclusion of this story, I think it's important to say that God wanted to test Abraham's heart, and he wanted to test his love. Because for Abraham, Isaac represented what the thing you're holding on represents to you. It's an emotional story because it's a family, it's a connection, but for a moment, whatever it is that you're holding on to, that's in a sense the Isaac in your life. Because see, Abraham had been promised by God that if he would leave everything and follow God, that God would provide and that he would lead him and build a nation out of him and do all these things through him. And so he left the familiar and he followed God, and he was holding on to this promise. This promise was about a relationship. It was about a relationship with God. It was this trust that he trusted God, that God would do what he said he would do, that God was all powerful, that God could bring something from nothing. And so he had to place faith in God. But the form of the promise was in the son. It wasn't really about the son. It was about God and his promises and the trust that Abraham needed to have in the father. But it took on the form of the son because Abraham had a son named Isaac, and God said, "It's going to be through Isaac that I'm going to make you a great nation." And so he was holding on to Isaac. Isaac was what brought pleasure to him. This is my son, and he's going to carry on the family name, and it's going to be a great thing. And I know God's faithful, and he's going to do this awesome thing, and I get to be a part of that. And I left everything so this could happen, and it's going to be through him. And he had to, in some sense, be holding on to that, not just in the normal sense that you would love your child, but in the sense that this is God's promises for me. This is what's going to bring me pleasure in my old age, and this is what's going to be my legacy, and all these things. And he was holding on to that, maybe like you would your career, maybe like you would your wealth, or maybe like you would some pleasure or something that brings fulfillment to your soul that's of this world, and he's holding on to it, and that's what brought him pleasure. And God said, "I want you to give that up. I want you to be willing to put even that back into my hands." And it was a test, but he said, "I want you to put that back into my hands." We had a little bit of an emotional night last night at our home because our neighbors that we love so much, they're military, and it was the last time that we were going to see them, at least for this season of life, because they are moving, and they're getting the next call, and they're going to the next place and for another tour, another term. And so our kids, it was a tough time for them because, man, when we moved into this house back in November, we've been there 6 months now. It was right before the church launched. It was the busiest time of our lives, and so God really provided something there in the gap of the craziness that was our life of moving and starting the church and all these things. And he provided these kids of our neighbors. 3 kids, 2 boys, Ian, Elliot, Libby, 2 boys and a girl, and they're almost the exact same ages of our 3 oldest. Our 2 oldest are boys, like they're 2 oldest, and then we have a daughter, and then we have another baby, and she's expecting a 4th. And so it was just, man, God put our families literally right next to our house. Like, it felt like such a divine placement, so purposeful. Well, last night had to be like the goodbye. They're pulling out this morning, and so all the kids were hugging each other and saying goodbye, and it was like so sad. And you got choked up a little bit, and because it's constant. It's like, Ian and Elliot are outside. Can we go play? And every day they're playing with these guys, and they're in each other's houses, but it's like the ending of something that was really good, and you don't know often what you had until it's gone, and that whole thing. And so they're saying goodbye. And I found myself really sad about that. But then later on last night, I started praying for them. Because I was thinking about our kids so much and what they're going to be missing and how it's going to break them and all that. But I was like, well, these kids, our neighbors that we love, like they're leaving, I don't know, they're friends, but they're leaving their home and the city they're familiar with, and they're going off into the unknown. They don't know what's next. They don't even have a place to live yet. Their house has a contract on it, but it's not sold yet, and all the unknowns of that. You know what it's like. You've probably been through a move, and wow. So I started praying for them. And it's a lot like Abraham. Abraham had to leave the familiar to go into the unknown, the unexpected. And he had no idea what was around the corner, but he knew he got the call. He got the orders, if you will. He knew what the mission was, and he served a greater mission. And I'm so appreciative. It's Memorial Day weekend, and there's so many things. Aren't you guys appreciative of the country we live in and those who serve and give of their lives? Literally, I think that's incredible for those who do so much. But man, they got the order. They had to go. And whether that puts you in the line of fire or that puts you in the unfamiliar, you go. And God says, Abraham, I need you to trust me. You know, it's like signing, I heard one person say it's like signing a blank contract. You don't know all the terms and conditions, but you say, yes, God, and you sign your name, and you give it back to him, and he fills in the blanks. You don't read through all the terms like we would do in a human agreement. Say, okay, God, if this is all going to work for my favor and I'm going to come out ahead, then yes. We say, no, God, I'm in, and we slide it across the table. Well, back in the story, in the closing parts of the story, down in verse 13, so God stops him. In verse 13, Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and he took the ram and he sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time, and he said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this, and have not withheld your son. So it was important that he didn't withhold his own, that whatever it was that he wanted, that he kept away from God, but that he lived his life open. God, whatever you need of me, I'm there and I'm available. It says, because you didn't withhold your son, that which you love most, your only son. He says, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies. And through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed. And because you have obeyed me. And part of it says, wow, God, that's a lot to ask. And it's, of course, a test, and he's not going to ask that of you, and that's a different thing. But he says this, this is a test. I'm asking you to give up your only son for me. You know what's interesting? We look at that story initially and say, God, how could you ask that? God didn't ask anything he was not willing to give of himself. You ever think of the fact that because of our sin and our rebellious nature against God, because we pushed back against God and rebelled against him, that he gave up his one and only son that he loved, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. He let him come to earth, although he was the king, and he came and he took on the form of flesh and the servant, and he lived this life and was spit on and mocked, and they beat him and they hung him on a cross, and he died an excruciatingly painful death that he didn't need to die, but he willingly did that for you and for me. And God gave of his own son. And so this was really foreshadowing, I believe, of what God was ultimately willing to do. And it really helps us see it in a different perspective when we think, wow, how could I ever be in Abraham's spot? And if God, wow, like how could, and God said, I'm willing to do that. And just so you know, I know how big of a commitment that is because I did that for you, because I love you so much. You know, God wants first place in our life, and he wants to have an unrivaled place, because if we love anything more than him, what we'll do is we'll put that on the throne, we'll worship that, and God knows that anything on the throne other than the King of all kings will leave us unfulfilled. You know, where this kind of gets difficult is when we bring it into our daily lives and we start thinking about pleasure in the forms of something that we want. And man, I mean, there's so many examples, but let me just give you one before we move on to this final point. You know, I think that in the context of, relationship is where it gets real. And we started this church a few months ago, and our initial series was on relationships called Getting Real. And it gets real fast when we talk about relationships. And when you think about a guy and a girl that get together, like Jennifer did when we were 19, and they start dating and they fall in love, and you think about that relationship and how it progresses. And you get into it a couple of years, and you're like, man, I think, maybe we're meant to be together, and, let's move in together, and, let's maybe sleep together, and let's that's just kind of a natural progression. And maybe you were taught like we were, and I'm so grateful God brought this teaching into our lives, and we were I'm so thankful that we were able to make it through that season of testing, I would call it, and save our virginity for our marriage until we got married. But man, there's that temptation, like that pull. You love this person, and you want to be together, and you want to be intimate. And our culture says, it's okay, just go ahead and be intimate, Test drive the car before, it's like, that's just part of the culture, and that's so natural and normal. But in God's boundaries, he said, man, I created relationship, and I created physical intimacy, but it's best when you wait and you have it in a relationship between a man and a woman in marriage, because in that relationship, there's all kinds of boundaries and protections, and man, it's so much purer, and it's between the two of you, and it's something that you share, and it's a gift you give each other, and there's so much symbolism and so much depth to it and all that we're not going to go into today, but man, wow, that's so powerful. But man, we're tempted and we're pulled to take that out of the context, or when you are married, to take it out of the context of that marriage vows and those marriage relationships. And God says it's supposed to be in that context that you have that physical relationship. But God, it's not really that big of a deal, right? Can I just have this pleasure in my life? Can I just do it the way I want to do it? Can I just take it and do what I want with it? And God, as a creator, says, I've created it. And so by you taking it out of the context and you doing what you want with sexual intimacy, and there's all kinds of forms of ways we can take it out of context, He says, what you're doing is you're putting that on the throne. That's more important than me. And you're saying, but God, my opinions, or culture says, or the media says, or my friends say, or I think that it should be okay to kind of do whatever I want with it, or whatever you think. God says, what you're doing is you're saying, no thanks, God. I know you created it and you put some boundaries around it that were for my benefit, but I'm just going to kind of like elevate that on the throne, and I'm going to live for that pleasure because I want that, or I think that's right, or that should be right, so I'm going to pursue that. And what happens is things unravel for us so fast, and there's so many examples of how that unravels. We're not going to go into that. But here's the point, and this point in your notes is that purposeful lives maintain a posture of surrender, of sacrifice, and trust. Let me explain why that's so important in context of that illustration. Surrender, sacrifice, and trust is that we surrender our rights to God, and we say, all right, God, here's signing the blank contract. What you say goes, I surrender to you. I'm sacrificing my own rights and my own interests in the same way that Jesus sacrificed his life, and I'm trusting you. I'm trusting you, God, in the end to bring about what is most important and to bring about what brings most pleasure into my life in the end. Deep and lasting pleasure that come from the hand of the Lord. God rewards us faithfully. And in Hebrews, the last verse I want to read today, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17, in the New Testament, written many years later, looking back on that story about Abraham. It's a chapter called, we know it kind of like the heroes of the faith. And it talks about all these great heroes of the faith. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17, it says, by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, he offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. So the promises he had embraced and held on to, God's provision for him was through his son. He was holding on to it. It says, verse 18, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac your offspring will be reckoned. Verse 19, Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. And so he had thought in his mind, like, God, you're asking me to give this up, but I so believe in your promise. I so trust you, and you're asking me to do something that does not make sense to me. I don't understand. I don't agree with it. I don't know why, and I question it, and I push back on it, and all these things. I so trust you that I can give back to you this thing that brings pleasure in my life because I know that you are most equipped to bring fulfillment in my life. That, God, I can trust you with everything because I know you have my best interest at heart in the end. And so here's what it comes down to, and I'll close this message this way. It comes down to an issue of trust and faith. Do we really believe, despite our rebel hearts that want to push back on God and do our own thing and seek our own pleasure and our own fulfillment, do we really believe that we will be most fully satisfied, most fulfilled with joy in God's presence? Or do we believe that that comes through chasing pleasure? Solomon, the wisest man to ever live, test drove pleasure for us. In other words, he said, pleasure makes a horrible God. I hope that each of us will be able to leave today in whatever area of our life that we're wrestling with this battle that's intrinsic in our nature, that we'll be able to surrender and say, God, I trust you even though I don't fully understand. I trust that what you have for me is greater and more fulfilling in the end than what I think even might be best for me. And so I surrender, I trust in you, and I'm going to follow your ways. And so I don't know what you need to do when you leave this message, but I put it this way in your notes because I think it's different for everybody. So final point on there. What will I start, stop, or continue on Monday? So when push comes to shove, Monday is, Memorial Day. It's a new day. It's a new week. You got some time to pull back, maybe think about things in a different way. What are you going to start? What do you need to start doing? What do you need to stop doing? Or maybe what is it that you need to continue doing? And God will lead you. The Spirit of God will lead you in that. But my hope is that we will put the King on his throne in our lives because he is on the throne. And that our rebel hearts will not push him off the throne in our own life and put something of lesser value up there like pleasure. Right on?
Thanks for watching Church Experience Online. Again, if you'd like to learn more, get connected, or help fuel the movement by giving, you can click on the appropriate links on the website. Thanks again for watching, and we hope to see you soon.